Welcome to episode 133 of 10 Minute Record Reviews. This time I'm going to talk about King Britt's debut album from 1997, When the Funk Hits the Fan. And what I have here is the original US pressing. In fact, I think still is the only US pressing of this, though apparently a vinyl re-release is scheduled for 2021. This is an album by King Britt, who's a Philadelphia DJ and producer, paying homage to all of the musical influences and surroundings and culture, frankly, that he experienced growing up in Philadelphia in the late 70s and in the 1980s. It's a double album. It's a cornucopia of disco, jazz, funk, hip hop. It's not any one of those things, but it's somehow an amalgam of all those things. King Britt is his real name. He was born in 1968 in Philadelphia to Pearl Britt and Jimmy Lee Britt. And Jimmy Lee was a barber. And around age 5, he asked his dad if he could DJ.
Yeah, I wouldn't really call it DJing, but more selecting records to kind of keep the peace.
Philadelphia, of course, in the 1970s was an absolute hotbed of music with Kenny Gamble and Leon Huff's Philadelphia International Records, the Philadelphia Sound. In addition to all that scene being nearby, Sun Ra, the famous jazz iconoclast and spaceman, became a family friend. Life was pretty tough in Philly in the 1970s and 1980s. And what happens is that King's parents send him to a school in central Philadelphia, which has a very diverse population. And it's through that diverse mix of students that he gets exposed, not just, of course, to the music that his family were into. It's also punk, prog rock, hard rock, you name it.
So I went to grade school at Greenfields, and that was my first exposure to music kind of outside of R&B and jazz. So I got more into rock, because we had a music appreciation class with Mr. Fell. And that's when I explored other cultural sounds. And then I went to Central High School from all over. Everyone's super intelligent. We're all trading music all day, all the time. And that's our life.
He was also growing up in Philadelphia at a time when, just like in New York, local DJs were inventing hip-hop. That was big, breakdancing was big, and following his own interests, King began to make his own loops and beats by doing his own sampling.
But I never thought I would be a DJ at all. I just admired it, and I collected vinyl, so I made tapes and stuff, but I didn't do it like they did it. I was just kind of mixing more, because I was more into, say, disco and house, moving into house, early iterations of house at this point. So we're talking mid-'80s, late 80s. And I was making blends. We called it blends. So you're mixing two records for a long time to create a whole new sound.
He graduates from high school, really wants to get into big-time DJing. His friends are saying it's all happening in the UK because at the time the house thing was really taking off.
I'm working at Tower Records. I'm the 12-inch buyer, so I'm buying all the vinyl from all over the world. And I had this obsession with the UK. I don't know, I just was obsessed with everything coming out of there ever since high school. The Smiths and Section 25, like all the stuff out of Manchester, Factory Records. I tried to move there because I worked at Tower, Philadelphia. All my contacts were from record buying. But, you have to be bringing something that they can't get in the UK. And I didn't really have that yet. And so I didn't, they were like, no, just, stay in Philly, whatever.
Back in Philly, he really throws himself into DJing, and he has a regular set at a place called Silk City, which starts to attract a bit of a following.
There was one girl who was opening Betsy Johnson in Philly. Betsy was in town. She brought her to Silk City because Betsy wanted like a New York vibe, and that was it. As soon as the girls came, the word got out. The music was good, and then everyone started coming. It exploded, bro.
He also, at this time, hooks up with a guy called Ishmael Butler from Diggable Planets. And Diggable Planets had not yet hit it big. Both Diggable Planets themselves, but also the label, want King Britt to join the band. And he says, I don't know, because I actually have a pretty good gig here going with all my DJing. But he's persuaded to join Diggable Planets on tour. And of course, what happens is their debut album takes off. It goes to number 15 on Billboard. It goes to number 5 on the R&B and hip-hop charts. And this then becomes a tour that never ends. But then life intervenes, as it has a habit of doing, because King Britt's wife is pregnant with their first child. He moves back to Philly and begins to develop his career again in a more local setting. He starts up one of the very first ever acid jazz radio shows. He starts up a record company, Ovum Records, with his colleague Josh Wink. And he starts to pull together a project which he had in mind for a while, which was a tribute to all of that musical ferment, all those different influences he experienced in the 70s and 80s growing up in Philadelphia. King Britt himself produces this album along with John Wicks, and many of the tracks were laid down at Third Story Recording in Philadelphia. Part of what gives this project its authenticity is that to get a flavor of that time, Britt uses a whole bunch of cameos, not just from his high school friends, but also from his parents. He also pulls together a huge cast of musicians, most if not all of whom are from Philadelphia, and who therefore share with King Britt that same set of musical influences and musical moments. The first and maybe the most significant of those is Alison Crockett, a singer that Britt sort of knew from Philadelphia but didn't really know that well, who at that point was singing over in London. He basically cold calls her and asked her to come over and sing a few tracks, thinking, wasn't going to happen. And her agent was saying, look, she never does these kind of guest spots. Well, she heard the songs and was delighted and flew back and did them. Antoine Green, also known as Capital A or Bun, is a rapper. Ursula Rucker, who is a spoken word artist from Philadelphia, a poet. Vicky Miles, another singer from Philadelphia, and then two more singers, Tanya Dixon and Alma Horton, who go by the name of Tea on the Rocks. King himself provides vocals, keyboards, synths, also obviously does a lot of the production, but then there's a whole other cast of characters called the Cosmic Lounge Orchestra.
And so at that time it was new. DJs with bands, we're keeping the dance floor going, but then we would drop out and then the band would keep the groove and improvise. And the band had many iterations constantly. So the drummers would change. It was Larry for 2 months. It was Chuck for 2 months, Dre and Vidal. So we would change musicians all the time to give everyone a chance. But then at one point, there was like the band. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
That's the band.
Yeah. There's no fewer than 4 bass players on here, including the most famous Jamaluddin Takuma, who's really kind of a giant in Philadelphia as a bass player and very well known in jazz circles as well. On drums is Daryl Burgess and Pete Rudd, who is a session drummer with Philadelphia International Records. Keyboards, James Poyser, who's a British guy. He's a multi-instrumentalist who's heavily associated with The Roots, which is a Philly hip-hop group. A guy called Tim Motzer on guitar. And there's also a whole bunch of horn players. Jafar Baran and Stan Slaughter on trumpet. Bob Howell and Robert Landum on saxophone, and Jeff Bradshaw on trombone. Side 1 starts with a bit of narration where King himself kind of sets up the concept. And then the first real song is Jimmy Leans Back. This is basically just an excellent jazz funk groove, really, really tight, syncopated percussion. That's followed by City 5-6 theme, which is the first of 2 raps by Capital A. But then we start to move into the real highlights, and in particular, it's the singing of 2 women, Alison Crockett and Vicky Miles, that really light this record up. The first of these is The Reason, which is built around a sample of Lowdown by Boz Scaggs. Side 1 then closes out with ERA, which is a spoken word piece by Ursula Rucker. Very, very powerful, so good. Side 2 is an amazing album side, not least because it's got 2 songs by Alison Crockett. The first of those is Getting Into It, which is a perfect piece of, well, what would subsequently be called G-Funk. The second of those is Seasons Change. Her performance is wonderful. There's also a really wicked piece of flute on this, and this, I don't know what it is. I don't actually know what the instrument is. Maybe it's a synth, maybe it's some analog instrument, I don't know. But it's a sound which goes whoop, 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 whoop.
The Lloyd McNeil quartet sample, ooh, 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 ooh. Yeah. It's a pretty big chunk. And then I added the jazz stuff over and all. But it just worked so well with Alice. Put some money aside, put an ad in Variety, just looking for where Lloyd McNeil is. There was no publishing info on it, and we found out he was teaching at Rutgers. And so then he wanted to collaborate, but we just never made it happen.
Those 2 songs by Alison Crockett sandwich a third song called When the Funk Swings, which is kind of a down-tempo reprise of the title track, and the title track itself occurs on side 4 in its disco format. It's also got some lovely muted trumpet in it as well. It's beautiful. The whole flavor of this side is just totally seductive. Side 3 doesn't quite live up to those standards, but it does have a couple of standouts. The first of those is Gorgeous, which is sung by Vicky Miles. The second of those is Ursula Rucker's second spoken word outing on the album, and that is A Day in the Life. The last side starts with New Love, King asking his mother a question about various attributes of Billie Holiday and what made her such a powerful singer, which is just kind of fascinating and fun to listen to. And then 3 wonderful, just get you out of your chair, upbeat tunes. And the first of those is Uptown, which is sung by Alison Crockett. This is just infectious, again, really snappy, tight percussion. And then we're on to 2 massive songs to close out the album, both of which are real dance floor monsters, sung by Tia and the Rocks. And the first of those is Last Night a DJ Saved My Life. And this, of course, is a cover. And that's followed by When the Funk Hits the Fan. This is a phenomenal track. A great disco tune, a great dance number. Best of all, it's got a clavinet, which is that instrument which for me just instantly transports you back into 1973, whether you like it or not. Really tastefully done here. It takes a lot of cojones to release as your first record a double album, a double concept album, and have the concept work as well as it does. And he sold 500,000 copies of this. But ultimately, records are not about cohesion and concepts, they're about the music. And this album absolutely delivers. It is funky as hell, and for me it's 4.5 out of 5 stars.